But let's talk about the Yellow Tavern War. For 3 years in this war so far, James Ewell Brown Stuart, Jeb Stuart, had literally dominated the cavalry scene in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. In fact, he had literally run circles around his opponents, repeatedly. His command had grown over the course of the war from a small brigade to a division to a corps, and his subordinates were trained and experienced cavalry commanders. It was really only a matter of time before Jeb Stuart would be promoted to a lieutenant general. And especially after we've had such a great discussion about attrition in the high command, sooner rather than later. In fact, it was a former friend of his and Union Corps Commander John Sedgwick who had probably the highest accolade for it. He said that Jeb Stuart was the greatest cavalry officer ever foaled in America. Everybody else had to be born. He was foaled. And then there's the loathsome little psychopath. It's not that I have anything against his background as an Irishman. I have nothing against his mother, really, per se, except one bad judgment. But it's all about this man. Philip Henry Sheridan spent the first part of the war out west, where he had vexed friend and foe alike as an infantry commander, not a cavalry commander. A U.S. regular named Henry Abbott knew this man quite well and wrote of him that I knew him personally not only at West Point where we were together, but in 1855 when we both served in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. And although I perfectly recognize the energy and activity, I have not the same respect for his moral honesty. Sheridan's immediate subordinates were a hodgepodge of experience themselves. There were 3 divisions that served under Phil Sheridan, and of his 3 division commanders, only one of them was a cavalryman. And that was the division led by David McMurtry Gregg, which we heard of with Gregg and talked about Samaria Church. One of the other division commanders was Alfred T.A. Torbert, which we just heard a little bit about with the North Anna. He was an infantry commander until 1864. And the 3rd division was led by a staff officer, James Harrison Wilson. Sheridan's debut in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War was an absolute miserable failure. He created a serious security breach on the advance to battle at the Wilderness, when it was Union infantry under Warren that had to discover the approach of the Confederates, not being given a heads up by the cavalry. He ruined the approaches to Spotsylvania Courthouse, as you heard with Chris yesterday. And his troops not only blocked the road themselves to Spotsylvania, but as you also heard, Sheridan wasn't even with his troops when Grant and Meade showed up. He had the temerity to ignore his immediate superior, George Gordon Meade, and to report always directly to Grant, even though Grant was not the Army commander. And then in Spotsylvania, when he blew his assignment, General Meade called him on the carpet for it. Now, we all know what George Meade's temper could be like. Sheridan, give him credit where credit is due, was unintimidated by that temper and had a bigger temper of his own, and proceeded to have the audacity to lecture his commander and tell him at Spotsylvania that Meade had no business commanding or ordering his troops about, as if it wasn't Meade's army to begin with, saying that Meade had no concept of what cavalry should do. That cavalry fights cavalry, and infantry fights infantry, And if you just left Sheridan alone, he could successfully whip Jeb Stuart. But he is hindered by George Meade. I have never, in the course of military history, ever heard a more stark admission of ignorance in my entire life. Cavalry fights cavalry and infantry fights infantry. That's not what cavalry is about. Cavalry is about intelligence gathering. It is about screening, either approaches or retreats, but it is about security and intelligence. Quite honestly, the easiest and most simplistic part of an entire cavalry role in 1860s is combat. Phil Sheridan not only told you that he's only gifted at the easiest part of the job, but he doesn't understand the job at all. Now, this is just 5 days into active campaigning with the Army of the Potomac, and it's already clear that Phil Sheridan has to go. Now, just a couple of days before, a general blew up at George Gordon Meade in the Wilderness. We all remember Charles Griffin, the king of the war dogs. And how did Grant react to that? He said that it was insubordinate and that that man should be relieved of command at once. His blow-up was not nearly as awful as Phil Sheridan's blow-up. Meade was fully within his rights to remove this person from his army. But he didn't do it. And he didn't do it because he was politically sensible to knowing that this was Grant's protege. And Grant had brought him east, and it was up to Grant to send him away, without embarrassing Grant by removing his protege for him. The unfortunate thing for George Gordon Meade is that he overstepped his argument by one sentence, offering that Sheridan has this bizarre notion that even if you left him alone, he could whip Stuart. Like anybody had done that successfully. And that was exactly the opening that Ulysses S. Grant jumped on. Because at that point, Grant said, "Did Sheridan say that really?" Because he generally knows what he's talking about. Let him do it. And that was the inspiration for the Yellow Tavern Route. In fact, Sheridan set off the very next morning of May 9, 1864, taking all 3 divisions of his cavalry, all 13,000 of his cavalry. Now, you heard about North Anna and Alfred Torbert leading the vanguard with just a couple thousand cavalry. Those are pickup units that came after Sheridan left. Otherwise, he probably would have dragooned them as well. Because Phil Sheridan left the Union Army of the Potomac with nothing for security or intelligence gathering. This isn't the first time that we've had a big raid in Virginia with cavalry. It's not the first time that we've had a cavalry corps commander who didn't quite understand his assignments. A year before this, during the Chancellorsville campaign, George Stoneman went on a deep sweeping raid into the Confederate rear, and it was a miserable failure. But he left the Union Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville without any security. And we all know what happened there when Jackson launched a successful flank attack that wrecked Joe Hooker's campaign. Joe Hooker, to be fair, didn't have a precedent for a cavalry raid in Virginia. General Grant did, because Hooker had done it the year before. And yet, he commits to the exact same mistake in 1864, leaving the Union Army blind and flailing. So what was the purpose of this raid to Yellow Tavern? Was it to draw off the Confederate cavalry and to give the Federal Army more freedom of movement? Was it to seize Richmond? Was it to cut Lee's line of communications? Or was it just simply to separate Philip Sheridan from George Gordon Meade? In fact, it's the last. It's about keeping both subordinates instead of losing one at the expense of the other. But really, should personalities govern operations? Should they shape operations? What happens if those personalities actually interfere with the operations? So we're looking at a raid that is built out of personality, not out of necessity or military significance. And Phil Sheridan is perfectly content with that because now he's an independent commander who answers to nobody except himself. As he set off from the Army of the Potomac, he didn't care about that army. He cared about him, and that's why he took everyone he had. If he was looking for stealth to get a head start on the Confederates, it didn't happen either. He was spotted almost immediately by General Fitzhugh Lee, who saw the Federal column that stretched for almost 8 miles from top to end along the Telegraph Road going past Massaponax Church. And Jeb Stuart responded at once. Jeb Stuart had 6 brigades of cavalry under his command. He took 3 of them and went off in pursuit of Phil Sheridan. He left 3 of those brigades behind to keep Robert E. Lee informed with intelligence and security, recognizing the true role of the cavalry in Virginia. So we're looking at 3 Union divisions against 3 Confederate brigades. The Confederates are bringing about 5,000 to 5,200 men to go after 13,000 Union soldiers. This isn't about combat. This is about diverting a raid and preventing tremendous loss of material or railroads or communications. But since the Confederates are reacting, they are also already behind in the race leading southward, wherever it may take them. As the Confederates took off after the Union column, they started to crowd their rear and attack them to slow down the Federals and develop what their real intentions were. And this turned into a series of running battles, starting at Gerald's Mill, which is very close to the Mud Tavern, in fact, just below Mud Tavern, that Chris had told you about. The Confederates attacked along this road, looking in the same direction as their attack was going, as the Federals were crossing the Ta River. They crowded the Union rear guard across the stream, but the Federals kept going. So the Confederates attacked them further down the road at Mitchell's Shop, where brigade commander for the Confederates, William C. Wickham, gave the order to his men, "Give them hell, boys, damn them, give them hell," and launched an impromptu attack right down the street and right into an ambush with the Union rear guard. And it turned into a tremendous melee. One member of the 4th Virginia Cavalry said it was a hand-to-hand fight was on, and pandemonium reigned in the street until the Federals were able to back away successfully. The Confederates attacked them again at Childsburg, just a little further down the road. By this point, Confederates had brought up their horse artillery and were able to shell the tail of Sheridan's column. And the Federals responded by U.S. pioneers chopping down trees and rendering the road behind them impassable for the moment. It didn't slow down the Federals, and in fact, the head of the column was able to get across the North Anna River under George Armstrong Custer and seize the railroad station at Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central at 5 p.m. They successfully freed 311 Union prisoners that were held at Beaver Dam Station. The Federals also destroyed over 900,000 rations for the Confederate Army. That amounted to over 50,000 pounds of bacon that was burned by the Federals when they got there. Sounds pretty impressive until you consider that that railroad was back up and running and feeding Confederates within 2 weeks. So it was only a 2-week blip, supply circuit, if you will. May 10th, 1864. Stuart was able to successfully crowd the Union Army away from its rear guard at Anderson's Bridge on the North Anna River and reoccupy Beaver Dam Station. He drove the Federal rear guard out, and then he paused for just a moment to go to the Edmund Fontaine House. Edmund Fontaine was the president of the Virginia Central Railroad. So he wanted a quick assessment of the damages in the area and how soon the railroad could get up and operational. But he also had a personal excuse for stopping because his wife, Flora, was staying at the Fontaine House when the Federal cavalry came through. They were completely unaware of her presence and did nothing to jeopardize her. But Stuart took just a moment to pause with his wife. In fact, things were so imperative in emotion that he didn't even have the opportunity to dismount his horse. He just leaned down and kissed her and was off. It was the last time husband and wife would see each other. The Confederates continued to pursue southwards after the Federals, and Sheridan pushed south to the South Anna River. Sheridan crossed the South Anna at a place called Ground Squirrel Bridge, near a place known as Goodall's Tavern, and then burned the bridge behind him. Sheridan was now deep in enemy country, but didn't seem to be dramatically affected by it. Much to the chagrin of his lieutenants, he spent the better part of the evening playing with kids in the neighborhood of Goodall's Tavern. One of the officers, a man named Samuel R. Chamberlain, wrote, "I saw General Sheridan at this place playing with some children on the front porch. And I always thought that this was an act somewhat antagonistic in those days to my idea of what a great general really was." He wasn't paying attention to his men or their needs. He was playing with children. Now, Stuart recognized that as they were moving ever closer to Richmond, that it became not only important to arrest the Federal advance, but also to get ahead of Sheridan's column. So at this point, Stuart made the decision to split his forces. Granted, they were already dramatically outnumbered, but it became now a matter of maneuvering. So he took 2 of the brigades under the division commander Fitzhugh Lee, and those were the brigades of Lunsford, Lomax, and William C. Wickham, and they split off to the east to get to the Telegraph Road and find a better, more direct route southward. Meanwhile, a 3rd brigade, led by a brigadier general named James B. Gordon, a distant kinsman of John B. Gordon. James Gordon was commanding a North Carolina brigade of cavalry, and he was to continue to shadow and harass Sheridan's rear. May 11th, James B. Gordon struck. His Confederates slashed across the South Anna River and pitched into the Union rear guard at Goodall's Tavern and surprised them. They drove them from their positions up to a place called the Ground Squirrel Church. And there the Federals were able to successfully rally and hold Gordon at bay. A member of the 5th North Carolina Cavalry, a fellow named Paul Means, said, "It was hand-to-hand, saber to saber in a deadly close combat." Another called it a full-fledged battle at the church. A member of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry noted that the fire on both sides was terrific. The lines no more than 30 yards apart, and every man could look into the eyes of his enemy and almost tell their color. Both sides engaged about 2,000 to 2,500 men, and then it was a standoff. As Gordon's men fell back to regroup, Sheridan's men continued inexorably on their way. Meanwhile, Stuart's column coming down the Telegraph Road trying to get ahead ran into parts of Federal advances at a place called Ashland on the railroad. There, William C. Wickham attacked a Union brigade led by Henry Davies and drove him out of action before he could do much damage to the railroad or to the railroad infrastructure, the station houses and the warehouses around it. Sheridan was off to a late start on the 11th, and that allowed Jeb Stuart to actually get ahead. He was able to move successfully south to a crossroads of the Telegraph Road that the Confederates were traveling on, and something called the Mountain Road, which was the road that Sheridan was on. That crossroads was marked by a yellow tavern. And people of that part of Virginia being so creative, immediately named it Yellow Tavern. But the important thing is that Stuart got there first. He beat Sheridan to the tavern by 1 hour. As soon as he reached that spot, Jeb Stuart was in direct contact with the War Department in Richmond and notified no less a person than Braxton Bragg. My men are tired, hungry, and jaded, but all right. Morale was strong, and they were prepared to do battle with the Federals. It was time to challenge not the tail of the column, but the head of the column. So at Yellow Tavern, Jeb Stuart made the decision not to go into the Richmond defenses with Braxton Bragg, but to deliberately stay out of them and to challenge, I should say, is a better word, the Union advance and crowd it, to prevent it from spreading out and creating too much havoc or damage, as raiders might do. As he set up a defense outside of Richmond at Yellow Tavern, he created a bizarre angled line. The top of it, William C. Wickham's men had a pronounced ridge that could look due south towards Richmond and to the Yellow Tavern. Lunsford Lomax was at a 90-degree angle from them and faced directly into the mouth of the mountain road where they were expecting the Union to advance. Jeb Stuart was going to personally oversee Lunsford Lomax's part of the line, and Fitz Lee was going to oversee Wickham's part of the line. Sheridan, again arriving in an hour, being Sheridan, failed to reconnoiter this position, and Lunsford Lomax lured him into a trap. As the Federals attacked straight against Lomax, they went across Wickham's front and got caught in a savage crossfire. A Michigan trooper who made a lunge in that original attack wrote, "We had not advanced 20 rods before a murderous crossfire was opened upon us out of the woods on our left and rear. Words cannot picture the scene that followed, but there is that level field without any chance of cover, and we were trying to return the fire, shooting in 3 different directions at the same time." The Federals inelegantly bulldozed right into a re-entrant angle and got caught in the crossfire and were easily repulsed. Jeb Stuart ran down the line after that first repulse and congratulated the regimental commanders, including Colonel Henry Clay Pate of the 5th Virginia Cavalry. It was a bizarre, odd exchange between Stuart and Pate. As they met, Stuart stopped and asked if Pate could hold on to his position. And Pate answered, "I will do it." Stuart thanked him for his firmness, and then the colonel walked over and they shook hands. It's a fairly nondescript little thing, except the bizarre part is those two hated each other. And they had hated each other long before the war ever began. They met in Bleeding, Kansas in the 1850s. And at one point, Jeb Stuart with the U.S. cavalry had saved Pate from no less a personage than John Brown. But ideologically, they did not like each other. And now, they were not only fighting together, but one was complimenting the other and relying on that. Eventually, Sheridan located the end of Lomax's line, dangling to the south towards Yellow Tavern, and was able to put direct pressure on that part of the line. Lomax's line began to give way. Colonel Henry Clay Pate immediately ran into the midst of the units that were starting to break beside him and pleaded with the 6th Virginia Cavalry to hold on for just 5 more minutes until he could bring his troops to help. But Henry Clay Pate was pierced through the head and killed on the spot. And Lunsford Lomax's brigade retreated. They were forced back to the north, away from Richmond and away from the Richmond defenses. So Stuart reconfigured his line at this point and straightened it out, straddling the turnpike and looking due south towards Richmond and Sheridan. By doing this, the Confederates had successfully, in one sense, put Sheridan in a Confederate sandwich, with Confederates under Braxton Bragg to the south, and now Jeb Stuart's forces to the north of them. It was very limiting in where Sheridan could go, maneuver, or create havoc. As the Federals looked at this, they reconfigured as well around the Yellow Tavern and launched an attack against Stuart's command to the north. Because it's not only a sandwich, but in another sense, the Confederate cavalry has isolated itself away from immediate help. And Sheridan outnumbered him dramatically. So he took advantage of that. And we had a wonderful discussion yesterday about how troops proceed in a cavalry action, whether they're mounted or dismounted. And you came to a wonderful conclusion about it is both. Commands have certain companies that they designate to be mounted troops that could be quick reactionary forces, but the real combat is relied upon and developed by those who are dismounted. In some cases, you have brigades where 4 regiments will be on foot, and 1 regiment will be designated as the Sabre Regiment and will stay mounted. In the Michigan Cavalry Brigade of Audie Custer, the 1st Michigan Cavalry were designated to be the Sabre Regiment, and they were mounted. Everybody else in that brigade was dismounted at this point. And Custer launched an attack straight up the Telegraph Road, right into the heart of Stuart's command. The 1st Michigan Cavalry and a portion of the 1st Vermont Cavalry literally bludgeoned their way up the highway and into the Confederate position. They forced it for a bit, creating a small breach, but the Confederates, most of them dismounted, have saber companies. And the 1st Virginia, that was Company K, that launched an impromptu counterattack. A company of mounted Confederates against a regiment of mounted Federals. But Company K came at an angle and were able to hit them in flank, threatened to cut them off from an exit strategy, and that compelled the Michiganders to back out of the breach very quickly. In the process of this, Jeb Stuart stood on a high bank of the Telegraph Road, helping direct this and offering encouragement. According to a member of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, Jeb Stuart, as usual, was in the hottest of the fight, cheering the men and emptying his revolver into the enemy at close range. One of the Federals who was trying to get out of the breach and back to safety was a dismounted man named John Huff, a member of the 5th Michigan Cavalry, and allegedly it's John Huff who, as he was trotting back towards safety, looked at a group of Confederates on the embankment and just absently turned around and fired blindly at them on his way out and hit Jeb Stuart. James D. Oliver, of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, wrote, "The bullet struck Stuart in the side, and I saw him press his hand to his side, and I said to him, 'General, are you hit?' 'Yes,' he replied. 'Are you wounded badly?' I asked. 'I'm afraid I am,' he answered. 'But don't worry, boys. Fitzlee will do well for you, just as I have done.'" Another member of the 1st Virginia Cavalry said, "The ball entered into his left side of his body through the top of his breeches pocket, and it passed through his kidney and through his body and out above and behind his right hip. It was a gutting wound that had destroyed his intestines and his kidneys. It was a fatal wound. Jeb Stuart was surrounded by well-wishers who led his horse about 100 yards behind the lines and dismounted him, trying to look at his wounds. Staff officers rallied around Jeb Stuart. A doctor named Fontaine tried to offer him alcohol as a stimulant to revive him somewhat. Jeb Stuart had never touched alcohol and had made a vow to his mother never to. But if it was a matter of life and death, maybe it was something that should be considered at this moment. So he turned to one of his staff officers, a young lieutenant named W.Q. Houlihan, who had the most unlikely martial nickname of Honey Bun, and asked him directly, "Honey Bun, how do I look in the face?" Because if there's a death caller, these men have become quite familiar with it over 3 years of combat. Houlihan reassured Stuart, "General, you're looking right well, and you'll be all right." And Stuart answered, "Well, I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, well, I'm ready." And perhaps that's a bit of lost cause mythology, but as with all good mythology, it's based in a root of truth. And so Stuart was keenly aware that his wound was a dangerous, if not fatal one at this point. He was put in an ambulance, and they started to cart him away from the battlefield. But he wasn't the only one leaving the battlefield, because Sheridan had launched now a second assault against the Confederate position with his dismounted cavalry, and they were able to successfully drive the Confederates from their positions astride the turnpike. They managed to capture 2 of Jeb Stuart's cannon, and the entire Confederate line had been compromised and was in retreat. They were all heading north, trying to get across the Chickahominy River at a place called Half Sink. Jeb Stuart from an ambulance saw them going in disarray and shouted at them, "Go back and do your duty as I have done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back," adding for emphasis, "I would rather die than be whipped." The Confederates continued to retreat anyway, and they took Stuart's ambulance with them, and they didn't stop until they were all successful at getting across the river. A chaplain for the 6th Virginia Cavalry wrote of Yellow Tavern, "This was the darkest day I have seen since I have been in the service." In a roundabout way, Jeb Stuart's ambulance was carried into Richmond, going around Sheridan. And he was taken to the home of his brother-in-law, Charles Brewer. And there he painfully lingered throughout the night of the 11th and through the day of the 12th. He was visited by Jefferson Davis and a myriad of other well-wishers. And they gathered around his bed and they sang hymns and they prayed. Jeb Stuart repeatedly asked for his wife Flora, and she had been sent for, but she would not arrive in time. Jeb Stuart died the evening of May 12th at 7:38 p.m., just when the Bloody Angle was becoming infamous as the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania. Jeb Stuart was only 31 years old. He was buried in Hollywood Cemetery, and that was the first marker over his grave. But the raid wasn't over. Sheridan's cavalry continued to press south directly towards Richmond at this point, and they entered the outer defenses of Richmond. According to James Barrett of the 1st Vermont Cavalry, "We were so near the city that the hazy lights were given off to us by the city lamps, and we could see it in the night." Fitzhugh Lee, instead of falling back from Half Sink and towards Lee, had decided to shift down the Chickahominy River and attempt to block any exit route for Phil Sheridan's cavalry. He decided to set up a defense at a place called Meadows Bridge, which is where the 7 Days battles began in 1862. There were 2 bridges at Meadows Bridge. One was for foot traffic and the other was a railroad bridge. Fitz-Lee burned the footbridge. He did not touch the railroad bridge. It seems like a job half done, but why wouldn't you touch the railroad bridge? It is the lifeblood of Robert E. Lee's entire army. And so it's the one thing you have to protect instead of destroy, even if it could compromise the defense. Now, not only was Fitz-Lee moving downstream to intercept, but there were 2 other elements in play at this particular time. Braxton Bragg had manned the defenses of Richmond with about 4,000 emergency troops and 3 brigades of veteran troops that were brought up from Beauregard and around Bermuda Hundred and Chaffin's Bluff. James B. Gordon of North Carolina, since we saw him at Ground Squirrel Bridge, continued to hover on Sheridan's tail and to crowd it. The Confederates literally had the Federals encircled. May 12th was a day of perpetual fighting and skirmishing. For the Federals, that meant fighting both to the front and to the rear simultaneously. David McMurtry Gregg, according to the 1st Pennsylvania Reserve Cavalry, was assailed on 3 sides as soon as it was sufficient light to make the attack. Every effort was made by the enemy to break our lines of our division. Confederates drove within musket range of James Harrison Wilson's hospitals. And when he reported that he needed help from Sheridan holding his line, Sheridan gave the obliging help of sending a platitude back. Go tell back to General Wilson and tell him to hold his position. He can hold it, and he must hold it, just apparently without help. Prisoners who had been captured already sensed the tide was turning. One Confederate prisoner was brazen enough to turn to a Union officer and said, "Hey there, Mr. Yank, I speak for your horse when we change and you become my captain." James Barrett of the 1st Vermont Cavalry said, "This was the hardest day fighting we ever had." General James B. Gordon, North Carolina, was mortally wounded in this action, struck down by a solid shot from artillery at a place called Brooks Church. In the heavy rain that was falling on Spotsylvania is the heavy rain that was falling on Richmond and on these combatants. Union cavalry officer Wesley Merritt was in the vanguard and was able to successfully capture the railroad bridge at Meadows Bridge and to force Fitz-Lee's men back away from the river crossing. A member of the 4th Virginia Cavalry said, "The fight occurred there was so terrible and done in a terrible thunderstorm, and that I could not tell the difference between lightning and cannon flashes." The Federals were able to successfully cross Meadows Bridge, get across the Chickahominy River, and withdraw unmolested to the east to connect with Benjamin Butler's Army of the James down around Bermuda Hundred. Sheridan's raid was on the road for 5 days. 5 days of operation. Sheridan and his troopers required 9 days to recuperate from that. So as we talk about punishing, relentless, grinding warfare in the Overland Campaign, we're not talking about Sheridan's guys, because they're going to take a 2-week vacation in the middle of this. The Union Cavalry is going to rejoin the Army of the Potomac on May 25th at the North Anna River. The Union Cavalry lost a number of men, over 700 during the raid, and largely through poor improvisations, like the initial assault at Yellow Tavern going into a re-entrant angle, or the poor security around Ground Squirrel Church. The Federals lost even more horses than men, because they had pushed them hard through Virginia without giving them a chance to rest or take water and horses dropped at a phenomenal rate. The Confederate losses were smaller, about 300 that fell, but proportionately larger than what the Federal casualties were. In the course of this raid, Sheridan had burned a depot at Beaver Dam Station. He had liberated prisoners to the number of 300, and he had scared Richmond. But he also was completely and utterly useless to Ulysses S. Grant. He left the Army of the Potomac blind for over 2 critical weeks of the Overland Campaign. He had cost the Federals several palpably decisive opportunities to exploit Confederate mistakes and miscues. And one of the biggest of them all was one that Chris shared with you, with Anderson going down the turnpike right in front of Warren. And yet there's no Union cavalry to discern where its strength and nexus was. And the moment went by. The lack of cavalry also made the Army of the Potomac vulnerable to surprise attacks and security breaches of their own, like a Confederate attack at the Po River in Spotsylvania, or Ewell's final gambit to get at the supply line at Harris Farm. None of those were detected by anything short of the moment of combat or contact between infantry. The lack of cavalry at Spotsylvania and onward almost cost General Grant and General Meade themselves their freedom. Both those generals were almost captured. Twice. We talked about one with Chris when we talked about Myers Hill in Spotsylvania and how George Meade was almost nabbed by the Confederates on that hill. But it happened again several days later at Guinea Station, when Chris also mentioned that 9th Virginia Cavalry was harassing the vanguard of the Union advance out of Spotsylvania. They came very close to walking right into the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, because there was no Union cavalry to alert them to the presence of these Confederates. It was the headquarters guard of the Army of the Potomac that actually had to fight the defense of their own headquarters. How often does that happen anymore? So, what was the net benefit of Sheridan's Yellow Tavern raid? Now, the Union cavalry commander put the most narrow interpretation you could on the success of this campaign. He set out to whip Stuart. And if you're looking at the fact that Stuart got killed, then that's a pretty elaborate and costly operation just for the elimination of one soldier. Or when we talk about whipping Stuart, are we talking about destroying the effectiveness of Stuart's cavalry? Sheridan made the claim that there was now a marked power shift from the preeminence of this Confederate cavalry in Virginia and its august, charismatic leader, Jeb Stuart, to now a new dominance, professional dominance of Union cavalry and its sporty little commander, Phil Sheridan. But was that true? Did Sheridan make that happen? Did he make that adjustment? Was Confederate cavalry destroyed as a result of him? And already I'm seeing heads shaking no. And I agree with you. Confederate cavalry was far from being destroyed by this raid of Sheridan's. In fact, Federal cavalry found hard times were not too distant in their future. What about Hawes Shop, when Union cavalry found itself toe-to-toe with Jeb Stuart's successor, Wade Hampton? Or Trevelyan Station, where the Federals had to retreat, and of course, Samaria Church, where again we talked about Union cavalry in retreat. Wilson's raid around Petersburg ended in disaster for the Horsemen of Blue. Preventing Wade Hampton having a beefsteak raid against Union supplies at Petersburg. Or even just trying to handcuff John Singleton Mosby in Central Virginia. Union cavalry had not created preeminence there at all. So in the end, does Union cavalry come into its own right? Grow? And I'm hearing no's, but I will actually disagree with you at this point. And I will say yes, cavalry is going to see a marked change, but it's not because they created the preeminence, but the Confederate cavalry had created that preeminence. In the end, Confederate cavalry could not compete effectively with Union cavalry, but that wasn't Sheridan's doing. It was because in the summer of 1864, Confederates had to redeploy to two different fronts, not only around Petersburg, but out into the Shenandoah Valley again with Jubal Early. And they split their cavalry commands to both theaters, and as a result, weakened themselves to the point where they were ineffective in both theaters. The loss of Jeb Stuart certainly was felt, but his loss did not destroy the Confederate cavalry's utility. Stuart's subordinates, Wade Hampton, Fitzhugh Lee, even the gaffing Rooney Lee, were all very capable and professional officers. Sheridan took nothing away from any of them. So did Sheridan actually make the Union cavalry better than the Confederate cavalry? Not really. It's actually quite the contrary. Sheridan put his own command in danger repeatedly, habitually, like at Meadows Bridge, where he got himself surrounded. And he relied on his subordinates to repeatedly redeem the situation for him. So, in this case, Sheridan did not make the Union cavalry. The Union cavalry had been coming of age since 1863, and it was ready to assert itself in 1864. Sheridan didn't make that happen. He didn't make the cavalry. The cavalry made Sheridan. And the end results they brought him became his narrative of success. So, in the end, the Yellow Tavern raid, Grant was able to keep Sheridan. But he also recognized that he couldn't keep him with the Army of the Potomac. So he sent him off to the Shenandoah Valley, where he would cause even more havoc in this war and take even more credit for his subordinates' achievements. It's hard to imagine. Little Phil, the man of the hour. Turns out it was somebody else's hour, he just stole it from him. So on our triptych, wherever demonic appearances occur, wherever we remind ourselves of the morality and the cost of morality, I'm sure that you will find not only a fellow with a pitchfork and horns, but also somebody with a red and white banner with 2 stars. The Yellow Tavern raid is just a sideshow to the overall Overland Campaign. But as we can see, it's not so much the story of what they did during the raid, but what it cost the others in their successes and failures. I leave it to you whether this is a worthy raid at all.